Okay, we left off with part one where my storage ran out on my camera. So we're going to pick it back up where I left off. But before I want to do that, I want to talk a little bit about what the convict has been saying to Pip. He's been telling him about this other young man and using this idea to scare Pip. Now, you may have gathered that there is no actual young man around. It's just that Pip is small and he's scared, and the convict has figured out that if he pretends there's somebody actually worse and scarier than he is, that Pip will be really scared and more likely to bring him the file and the food. So the convict says, "Now," he pursued, "you remember what you've undertook, and you remember that young man, and you get home." Good night, sir," I faltered. "Much of that," said he, glancing about him over the cold, wet flat. "I wish I was a frog or a eel." At the same time, he hugged his shuddering body in both his arms, clasping himself as if to hold himself together, and limped toward the low church wall. As I saw him go, picking his way among the nettles and among the brambles that bound the green mounds, he looked in my young eyes as if he were eluding the hands of the dead people, stretching up cautiously out of their graves to get a twist upon his ankle and pull him in. Well, that's an interesting phrase. We're not quite done with chapter 1, but think about what Pip is doing right there. Like, Pip has been scared half to death. He's been tipped upside down. He's been, harassed in this graveyard at night when it's creepy, and he's met this weird guy who's obviously not quite right. But Pip still has the empathy to look at him and kind of feel bad for him. Like, it's almost like the convict is the scared one, and Pip is seeing that in him as he's walking amongst the gravestones. It tells us a little bit something about Pip's personality. Charles Dickens, in all of his books, early on in the books, tries to give you a sense of the goodness of his favorite characters, and I think this is one of those little moments. When he came to the low church wall, he got over it like a man whose legs were numbed and stiff, and then turned around to look for me. When I saw him turning, I set my face toward home and made the best use of my legs. Sorry, I think there's a plane going by. Hope you can't hear that too much. But presently I looked over my shoulder and saw him going on again toward the river, still hugging himself in both arms and picking his way with his sore feet among the great stones dropped into the marshes here and there for stepping places when the rains were heavy or the tide was in. The marshes were just a long black horizontal line then as I stopped to look after him, and the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad nor yet so black, and the sky was just a row of long angry red lines and dense black lines intermixed. On the edge of the river I could faintly make out the only two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing upright. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered, like an unhooped cask upon a pole. An ugly thing when you were near it. The other, a gibbet with some chains hanging to it, which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on toward this latter as if he were the pirate come to life, and come down and going back to hook himself up again. A gibbet is like a gallows where they would hang people. So this is kind of another spooky image. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so, and as I saw the cattle lifting their heads to gaze after him, I wondered whether they thought so too. I looked all around for the horrible young man and could see no signs of him, but now I was frightened again and ran home without stopping. So that's chapter 1. We are left with more setting, scenery. There's all these horizontal lines creating, the setting between where Pip lives and the water. In some ways you might think of this as kind of symbolic. Pip has a long way to go in his life. We're going to stick with him through some adventures, and he's going to be kind of passing these different thresholds as he gets closer to whatever his destination is. And so I think this is a kind of symbolism with all these lines that he's going to either go down or go across. Okay, chapter 2. I probably won't read the whole thing with you, but we'll read a little bit so you get a sense of some of the new characters who were introduced in this chapter. My sister, Mrs. Jo Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I, and had established a great reputation with herself and the neighbors, because she had brought me up by hand. Having at that time to find out for myself what the expression meant, and knowing her to have a hard and heavy hand, and to be much in the habit of laying it upon her husband as well as upon me, I supposed that Jo Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. So, this is Dickens being funny. Now, hopefully, as we read this and we talk about it, you'll start to see why almost every page has something really funny in it when you read Charles Dickens. This idea of bringing somebody up by hand could just mean they brought you up. They took it upon themselves to help you grow up and mature. But when he says that she had a hard and heavy hand, Pip, the narrator, is telling us something else, and that is that she would beat them, and that bringing him up by hand means something else entirely, and that is that she's very strict and abusive, actually. And of course, this was not uncommon back then, and I'm sure it still happens today, that sometimes somebody who doesn't really want to be a parent or in the role of a parent would take that out on their kids, in this case her younger brother, who she's having to raise. And we know that she's having to raise him because his parents died early. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and I had a general impression that she must have made Jo Gargery marry her by hand. In other words, forced him into marrying her with violence. Joe was a fair man with curls of flaxen hair on each side of his smooth face, and with eyes of such a very undecided blue that they seemed to have somehow got mixed with their own whites. He was a mild, good-natured, sweet-tempered, easy-going, foolish, dear fellow, a sort of Hercules in strength, and also in weakness. So he's describing Joe, and Joe becomes one of the most important characters in Pip's life. And this image of him having undecided blue eyes that mix themselves with the whites is a peculiar image, but and it's kind of pretty, but it also tells us a little something about Joe, and that Joe's not the brightest character in the world, and that in a way his mind is kind of mixed up, like his eyes are mixed up. My sister, Mrs. Jo, with black hair and eyes, had such a prevailing redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap, like a cheese grater. That would be kind of gross. She was tall and bony, and almost always wore a coarse apron fastened over her figure behind with 2 loops, and having a square impregnable bib in front that was stuck full of pins and needles. She made it a powerful merit in herself, and a strong reproach against Jo, that she wore this apron so much, though I really see no reason why she should have worn it at all, or why, if she did wear it at all, she should not have taken it off every day of her life. So, basically, she's wearing this apron as kind of a way of showing how much work she does around the house, whereas Pip is saying she doesn't do actually all that much work. So she's always kind of making Jo and Pip feel guilty that she's working so hard. But it's also kind of funny that it's got all these pins and needles sticking out of it, right? So she's almost like a little porcupine or hedgehog. Joe's forge adjoined our house, which was a wooden house, as many of the dwellings in our country were, most of them at that time. When I ran home from the churchyard, the forge was shut up, and Joe was sitting alone in the kitchen. Joe and I, being fellow sufferers and having confidences as such, Joe imparted a confidence to me the moment I raised the latch of the door and peeped in at him opposite to it, sitting in the chimney corner. "Mrs. Joe has been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip, and she's out now making it a baker's dozen." "Is she?" "Yes, Pip," said Joe, "and what's worse, she's got Tickler with her." At this dismal intelligence, I twisted the only button on my waistcoat around and around and looked in great depression at the fire. Tickler was a wax-ended piece of cane worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. "She sot down," said Joe, "and she got up and she made a grab at Tickler and she rampaged out. That's what she did," said Joe, slowly clearing the fire between the lower bars with the poker and looking at it. "She rampaged out, Pip." "Has she been gone long, Joe?" I always treated him as a larger species of child and as no more than my equal. "Well," said Joe, glancing up at the Dutch clock, She's been on the rampage this last spell about 5 minutes, Pip. She's a-comin'. Get behind the door, old chap, and have the jack towel betwixt you. So, again, this is kind of a joke of Dickens, right? She has this cane called the tickler, which she uses to tickle Pip's frame, but of course she's beating him with it. And he and Joe are in some ways both like her children, and Pip thinks of Joe that way, even though he's much older. And they're kind of in it together to escape from Mrs. Joe's abusive habits. So the two of them are kind of like this. I took the advice. My sister, Mrs. Joe, throwing the door wide open and finding an obstruction behind it, which of course we know is Pip, immediately divined the cause and applied tickler to its further investigation. She concluded by throwing me, I often served as a connubial missile, at Joe, who, glad to get a hold of me on any terms, passed me on into the chimney and quietly fenced me up there with his great leg. So a sentence or a paragraph like this has so many little things. So Mrs. Joe throws the door wide open. She senses that there's something behind it. She takes tickler and she's kind of, pushing at whatever's behind the door. Of course, it's Pip. Pip runs out, or she pulls Pip out. She throws Pip toward Joe. This is the connubial missile. Connubial means like related to marriage. And so he's like a missile that she throws trying to hit Joe. And Joe is glad to get a hold of Pip so that he can protect him. So Joe puts Pip behind him next to the chimney. So, this happens very fast, but it kind of shows us the craziness of what goes on in this household. "Where have you been, you young monkey?" said Mrs. Joe, stamping her foot. "Tell me directly what you've been doing to wear me away with fret and fright and wort, or I'd have you out of that corner if he was 50 pips and he was 500 gargeries." "I've only been to the churchyard," said I from my stool, crying and rubbing myself. "Churchyard?" repeated my sister. "If it weren't for me, you'd have been to the churchyard long ago and stayed there. Who brought you up by hand?" Of course, she's saying he would have been to the churchyard. He would have been dead. "You did," said I. "And why did I do it, I should like to know?" exclaimed my sister. I whimpered. "I don't know." "I don't," said my sister. "I'd never do it again, I know that. I may truly say I've never had this apron of mine off since born you were. It's bad enough to be a blacksmith's wife and him a gargery, without being your mother." My thoughts strayed from that question as I looked disconsolately at the fire. For the fugitive out on the marshes with the iron leg, the mysterious young man, the file, the food, and the dreadful pledge I was under to commit a larceny on those sheltering premises rose before me in the avenging coals. "Ha!" said Mrs. Joe, restoring Tickler to his station. "Churchyard indeed. You may well say churchyard, you two." One of us, by the by, had not said it at all. I mean, Joe. "You'll drive me to the churchyard betwixt you one of these days, and oh, a precious pair you'd be without me." As she applied herself to set the tea things, Joe peeped down at me over his leg as if he were mentally casting me and himself up, and calculating what kind of a pair we practically should make under the grievous circumstances foreshadowed. Meaning, they're thinking, what would happen to us if Mrs. Joe died? After that, he sat feeling his right side flaxen curls and whisker, and following Mrs. Joe about with his blue eyes, as his manner always was at squally times. Squally times, if you know what a squall is, it's like a big storm. My sister had a trenchant way of cutting our bread and butter for us that never varied. First, with her left hand, she jammed the loaf hard and fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin into it, and sometimes a needle, which we afterward got into our mouths. Then she took some butter, not too much, on a knife and spread it on a loaf in an apothecary kind of way, as if she were making a plaster, using both sides of the knife with a slapping dexterity in trimming and molding the butter off around the crust. Then she gave the knife a final smart wipe on the edge of the plaster, and then sawed a very thick round off the loaf, which she finally, before separating from the loaf, another plane, hewed into two halves, of which Joe got one and I the other. So he's just showing how kind of inept she is about preparing food. She's just putting butter on bread, and she's doing it more like an apothecary, which would be like a pharmacist now. She's just not obviously a very good person in the kitchen, and that's the point there. On the present occasion, though I was hungry, I dared not eat my slice. I felt that I must have something in reserve for my dreadful acquaintance and his ally, the still more dreadful young man. I knew Mrs. Joe's housekeeping to be of the strictest kind, and that my larcenous researches might find nothing available in the safe. Therefore, I resolved to put my hunk of bread and butter down the leg of my trousers. So, he's saying, his researches, in other words, his attempt to steal food later on for the convict, are probably not going to amount to much, so he needs to keep the bread and butter that she just gave him for the guy out on the marsh. The effort of resolution necessary to the achievement of this purpose I found to be quite awful. It was as if I had to make up my mind to leap from the top of a high house or plunge into a great depth of water, and it was made the more difficult by the unconscious Joe. No, he's saying unconscious. He doesn't mean Joe is literally unconscious. He means Joe is not conscious of what he's doing with the bread and butter. In our already mentioned Freemasonry as fellow sufferers and in his good-natured companionship with me, it was our evening habit to compare the way we bit through our slices by silently holding them up to each other's admiration now and then, which stimulated us to new exertions. So, in another way, this is kind of like Joe being a little kid. Like, they just compare how they're eating their bread, like kids might, like, I took a big bite, I took a bigger bite, or whatever. It just shows their closeness. Tonight, Joe several times invited me, by the display of his fast diminishing slice, to enter upon our usual friendly competition, but he found me each time with my yellow mug of tea on one knee and my untouched bread and butter on the other. At last I desperately considered that the thing I contemplated must be done, and that it had best be done in the least improbable manner consistent with the circumstances. I took advantage of a moment when Joe had just looked at me and got my bread and butter down my leg. Joe was evidently made uncomfortable by what he supposed to be my loss of appetite, and took a thoughtful bite out of his slice, which he didn't seem to enjoy. He turned it about in his mouth much longer than usual, pondering over it a good deal, and after all gulped it down like a pill. He was about to take another bite, and had just gotten his head on one side for a good purchase on it, when his eye fell on me, and he saw that my bread and butter was gone. The wonder and consternation with which Joe stopped on the threshold of his bite and stared at me were too evident to escape my sister's observation. "What's the matter now?" said she smartly as she put down her cup. "I say, muttered Joe, shaking his head at me in a very serious remonstrance. "Pip, old chap, you'll do yourself a mischief. It'll stick somewhere. You can't have chawed it, Pip." Anyway, I'm probably going to stop here now, because I think you'll be able to kind of figure out what's going on. Basically, Joe thinks Pip just swallowed the whole bread and butter in like one gulp. And he's worried about Pip. He thinks he's going to choke or something. So they talk about that for a while. It just gives us a chance to see how the three of them interact, and how Mrs. Joe is just kind of mean and short-tempered. It turns out that, this is not a spoiler, that it's Christmas Eve, and that complicates things for Pip as he tries to get the stuff for the convict. And hijinks ensue, basically. Some other people come by eventually. One thing you should know as you keep reading is the hulks are talked about. The hulks are basically these ships that have been abandoned out on the marshes and are being used as prisons. And so that's where presumably this convict has come. So, yeah, I think, hopefully that gives you a good start to the book. Pip is a great character. Joe is a great character. There are so many other really awesome characters that come into this book, some of whom are some of the most famous in all of literature. So I think it'll be a fun book to read, and we can talk about it at a couple different book club meetings, because we'll read it over a couple months, and hopefully you enjoy it, and it'll give you the desire to read more Dickens in the future, because there's plenty of novels by Charles Dickens, and all the ones I've read at least are really, really good. So I look forward to book club meeting, and hopefully these little videos helped you get started, and enjoy.